All right, Fascia Friday, episode 10. In this episode, I want to take a look at the plantar fascia, which is a really sophisticated structure and has a lot of significance for the function of the foot and the lower leg, and then, of course, from the body from there on. But the plantar fascia is a very interesting tissue, and I think sometimes gets misconstrued as just being this, one singular sheath that just kind of layers the bottom of the foot and doesn't really have a ton of precise or specific mechanical action, and that's really far from the truth. But if we start out here with just kind of a base anatomy 101 of the foot, we know that we have three primary arches, 3 or 4 depending on the source that you're looking into, but for the sake of this, we have the medial longitudinal arch, which is represented here in purple and green, and you see that the medial arch actually kind of takes up about 2/3 of the surface area of the foot. And then on the outside here, we have the lateral longitudinal arch, which is probably accounting for about 1/3 of the foot. And then we also have the transverse arch, which isn't really depicted here, but essentially the transverse arch is kind of running in this diagonal fashion here, deep to the plantar arch, the medial arch, and is more responsible for the control of pronation, supination, and kind of the compliance of the foot. But jumping back primarily to the medial arch here, the tissue of the foot is very, very dense and fibrous. So this is a very thick band of tissue spanning the bottom of the foot here that has a very high strain resilience or tolerance, and is able to be very malleable. So in a sense, this is a similar type of tissue or density as we would see with something like the IT band or the lumbosacral fascia in the lower back. Beyond that, the medial arch, the plantar arch, has independent attachments to all 5 toes. And something that myself included, but a lot of people get misconstrued on, is thinking that the medial arch really just runs from the heel to the big toe. And while that's a primary component of this arch, we do need to understand that there's an independent attachment at all 5 toes. So when we're getting into toe flexion, we have to make sure that we're getting beyond focusing on just the big toe here and really getting all 5 involved in order to fully tense or load that medial arch. Beyond that, the primary responsibilities of the plantar arches are to provide structure and support for the foot. This is going to be in both a passive and a dynamic sense. And then more importantly, especially for athletes, is being a massive force transmitter and dispersing force upon ground contact. The stiffness of the arch, this is something that can be a little bit misunderstood because of the association to plantar fasciitis. But if we don't have good mechanical stiffness through these plantar arches, to include all 3, then we are going to have too much segmental motion or movement in the bones of the foot, which is ultimately going to compromise our ability to load and produce forces. So it's really important that we delineate between the tissue being fibrotic in the sense that it's brittle and it's damaged, and then just also having good, appropriate mechanical stiffness. Kind of building off of that point, some of the problems or the common issues that we see with the plantar arches are, of course, number 1, plantar fasciitis. And anytime that we see the word itis, or I guess the add-on itis, but fasciitis, tendonitis, bursitis, arthritis, I just really simplify that as being a mismanagement of volume and intensities. So in other words, we're doing too much of something while not doing enough of other things, and that can be as simple as too much work and not enough rest, but normally it's a little bit more involved with that. But at any rate, whenever we see these itises, it's typically just a mismanagement of inputs. So what we need to do in this case is we need to kind of break down what the overall workload is, where they're getting stress, how they're getting stress on the foot and on the arch, what are the modes of exercise or training that are accumulating these loads, and then what do we need to fill in with on a restoration side, or in some cases, improving certain strength components. So a good one to note on that is the ability to intrinsically or eccentrically splay the foot, which is, increasing the surface area of the foot, being able to kind of spread the toes, open the foot to the floor. That's a critical feature for the plantar fascia because, being on the bottom of the foot and the toes, wanting to flex down and kind of curl in, that is creating chronic and repetitive shortening of the plantar arch. So the more presence of shortening that we have in the arch, the more difficult it's going to be able to open and splay that foot. If we can't open and splay that foot, we can't absorb ground forces properly. So then therefore we're going to create some sort of mechanical overloading, and we go back to what we started with. Now we're looking at either plantar fasciitis, foot tendonitis, we're looking at a midfoot sprain, etc., etc. The plantar fascia and the to include the intrinsic muscles here as well are very commonly weak in athletes, and I think that this is really just an indication of a lack of attention to detail. Not deliberately and explicitly training the foot will allow it to become weak, and if we're always in cleats or we're always in shoes with what we're doing, then we're never really getting true ground interaction, and we're not really allowing the foot to be dexterous and move the way that it moves, so that we're not able to get true loading on that plantar arch. One note here too is that with the feet, and to include the plantar fascia here, the circulation to the feet is typically something that gets compromised as we age. This is also going to be the case for athletes who are much bigger in size, just because of the difficulty or the challenge for distal circulation. So whenever we're talking about the plantar fascia, one of the first things that always comes to mind for me is improve the circulation by any means that you know how to. If we don't have good circulation to the foot, if we don't have good tissue hydration, good presence of hyaluronic acid, synovial fluid in the joints, then all of the adaptations and all of the strength inputs, the mobility inputs thereafter are all going to kind of come at a compromised return. So we have to make sure that there's good circulation in order to properly address the plantar fascia. Now, if we look more at the biomechanics of this is where it starts to get more interesting. The foot is a great representation of the demand for reciprocating mechanical actions. The foot is highly dexterous and it moves in a very peculiar manner. There's a lot of range of motion and a lot of kind of precise, refined motions at the foot. But if we look at this in terms of some of the big gross relationships, the first one that we can point to here is the internal and external rotation of the tibia. So whenever we have tibial external rotation, we're going to see corresponding forefoot eversion, or that pinky toe kind of coming up and away from the midline, while we also have rear foot inversion, so the heel kind of ducking down and in underneath the ankle. The opposite would be true for tibial internal rotation. We would see forefoot inversion, and then we would see corresponding rear foot eversion. So this is something that's referred to as the twisted plate model, which I'll be honest was actually kind of a new terminology for me personally. But the point in case remains where there's this winding and kind of twisting effect of the foot. And when we see motions like inversion and eversion, it's not just one segment or all three segments for that matter of the foot performing that action. There is going to be a reciprocity to the three segments of the foot. Another thing that we want to be aware of here is the windlass effect. The windlass mechanism of the foot is something I've spoken about and talked about a lot over the years, but essentially this is the extension of the toes and then the suspension of the heel or plantar flexion of the foot. And what that is doing is it's getting full mechanical loading on the plantar arches by extending through the toes and then elevating that heel. One other caveat on that, kind of tying back to a previous point, I was guilty of this myself where I was really adamant about the big toe extension plus heel elevation, but as we saw on that previous slide with the independent toe attachments, when we're talking about extending the toes, don't just think about the big toe, think about all of them. Pronation supination is going to be absolutely critical, especially for athletes, especially for high velocity sprinting. the pronation and the supination mechanisms of the foot are highly, highly important for the arches and for the sake of getting, that full tensioning and full locking and winding mechanism of the foot. When we lose pronation, I think about this as kind of compromising the spring. As we go into toe off and we press through, big toe extension, that's coming with a great deal of midfoot pronation. Similarly, with supination, I think about this as almost a compromised transfer or a compromised dispersion of force, because as the foot initiates ground contact, we tend to land more in a supinated position. So we want to make sure that we have good compatibility and balance between those two. Another significant relationship with the plantar fascia is the one with the Achilles tendon. There is a direct and a significant relationship between the plantar fascia and the Achilles tendon. So we know plantar fascia inserts on the anterior inferior aspect of the calcaneus. The Achilles tendon is going to insert on the posterior superior aspect of the calcaneus. As we know, the Achilles tendon is the biggest and the strongest tendon in the body, so we're getting a lot of pull and a lot of torque on the calcaneus from the Achilles. And similarly, with the plantar fascia, we're getting a lot of anterior translation on the calcaneus through contraction of the plantar fascia. So when we have problems with the plantar fascia, we have to understand that it if nothing else, creates vulnerability for the Achilles tendon, and then vice versa as well, where when we see things like Achilles tendinopathy, we can't treat that in isolation because there's a corresponding effect on the plantar fascia as well. These two, there's not necessarily an empirical relationship between the two, at least not one that I'm aware of, but we want to be mindful of this and get a good evaluation of where the calcaneus is positioned in resting positions or in resting posture, doing some manual palpation, how much glide calcaneal movement do they have, can the calcaneus invert and evert appropriately. When we see deficits at the calcaneus, we have to immediately think above and below and address both of those tissues appropriately to kind of get that calcaneal position where we need it to be, so that there's even distribution of stress and force between those two tissues. So now here we have a little animation video to kind of show that winding and that locking mechanism of the foot. And as you can see here, all aspects of the foot, from all 5 metatarsals, all 5 toes, the segments of the midfoot, the talus, the calcaneus, the ankle, and tibia are all in motion whenever the foot is in motion. And it's really this symbiotic relationship between all constituent parts. So we have to understand that really when we're talking about the foot, very rarely is anything going to be effective in isolation. We have to understand these mechanical relationships. But I mentioned it a second ago, loss of pronation, supination is going to compromise this winding and locking mechanism. So, with my experience over the last year being back with the athletic population, it was kind of shocking for me to see how difficult supination especially was for a lot of athletes, and how that's kind of a lost path of motion or mechanical action. When we can't supinate, we're going to be inclined to overpronate. When we overpronate, we're going to, put the plantar fascia in jeopardy for being chronically shortened. We shorten the plantar fascia, and now there's a disproportionate pulling on the Achilles tendon, and then now we just kind of are up shit's creek without a paddle. So, I think that sometimes the foot gets overlooked for being just an indirect thing or something that we can train, with everything else, and we don't need to really put attention to. I patently disagree with that. I think that that's a really short-sighted way of going about it, especially with the chronic repetitive loading that we see on the feet. So much repetition for athletes in practice and in training. And if we're not, mindful of what these consequences can be, I think we can really, potentially set athletes up for some failure. To kind of summarize here on the training points, and I'll have some more information and articles and stuff coming out on this, but really, when we're thinking about the plantar fascia or the feet in general, we got to start with proprioceptive acuity. Our ability to detect creates our opportunity to respond. And so at the foot, that's going to be absolutely a priority. Intrinsic foot strength, I mentioned, but being able to splay and open and eccentrically load through the foot. Compliance and stability kind of goes back to that pronation, supination coupling, and being able to kind of, transition and translate across the different borders of the foot. And then that windlass mechanism, being able to really fully load and tense the medial arch and really being able to store and release energy. Hopefully y'all got something good out of that. Just a reminder, Fascial Mechanics for Sport is going to be coming up here soon, releasing exclusively through Simply Faster. We're shooting for a January timeline, so keep an eye on that. We'll have some more videos and some kind of sneak peeks coming up over the next several weeks as we lead up to the release date.